Hi, this is VBlann. I am going to go over the Emancipation Proclamation, the freed slaves of the Civil War. This article, let me see who, was written by Civil War Home. I found it online, civilwarhome.com, and I found it quite interesting because I do recall, and one of the classes that I've taken at the university um, that spoke about the Civil War and the American politics and the freed slaves option were given to them. They were given an alternative option by President at the time Lincoln, who had freed the slaves around the 19th century, like 1876. But the U.S. Congress passed a Confiscation Act in 1862. But these slaves were given a choice to, in order for them to be happy in the United States, that an alternative option was, for them to leave, and they would be transferred over to an island like Hispaniola, transferred over to an island, Hispaniola, until things had calmed down in the United States, because it was around the time when these Congress had passed many constitutional rights that were for the people, but the clauses that were in there for the Jim Crow clause, it mentioned that a slave was free unless he committed a crime. And so that was something, it was like these little clauses that they put in there were always a but in there. It was always, something that will open the door for the abusers, who in fact were um, their masters, or their federal commanders, who had transferred them over to their masters. But some of these men were buying slaves and bringing them over to their plantations to do particular sharecropping assignments, and then they would give them like a hut in the back or whatever, and they were subjective up under these conditions that were deplorable, and in fact these slaves were not really fed properly, but they had to get up early in the morning and go out and work the fields, and sometimes they didn't come in until nightfall. But anyways, some of the slaves had decided to leave and board a ship that Lincoln had set aside for them. And it was at least about 5,000 slaves boarded the ship, and is one of the reasons why some of them were already here in the United States, are looking for archives to prove that they were already U.S. citizens. So why do they need to get a green card, or why would they need to go through so much problems at immigration to become a U.S. citizen? Because of their ancestry history, the ancestry around the time that these slaves were moved to Hispaniola, or of which today is Cuba, or any island that was connected to Cuba, like Puerto Rico. But Puerto Rico is now a part of the States. But there was some question in whether or not Jamaicans, or whether or not Grenadians, or people who in fact were moved to the islands, had rights to claim their U.S. status, because they were here, but they were encouraged by President Lincoln, when he freed the slaves, to take that ship, and to, so that you will not be placed in any harm, because they had so many laws that were coming up that they were proposing to Washington, and these were wealthy aristocrats and wealthy men, and that proposed these laws, and they were politicians to help free the slaves that were being abused and killed and lynched, and they were given freedom. And so I'm going to go over the freed slaves of the Civil War. The freedmen was a term given to those slaves who became free men after the U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1862. And under the act, Confederates who did not surrender within 60 days of the act's passage were to punished. They were to be punished by having their slaves freed. So, if the Confederates who were Union soldiers did not surrender within 60 days of the act's passage of 1862, surrender those slaves, they were to be punished by having their slaves freed. Okay? Now, when the slaves were freed, they would run into, coincidentally, into bounty hunters, of what they would call the large mobs of white men, middle-class men, were looking for freed slaves because of the Confiscation Act of 1862. It also dealt with a problem that had plagued field commanders occupying Southern territory. So the field commanders that were occupying Southern territory, they had to deal with, bringing in slaves, and they really weren't given enough resources so that they would be able to take care of them until they were able to move them over to and pass them over to particular compounds that were being designed for them and built for them, as there were decisions made on how they were going to accommodate the freed slaves. As troops advanced, slaves sought refuge in Union camps, and federal commanders were confused over their obligations to the refugees. So slaves were considered refugees because at this time they were migrating and they were moving them around into different colonies and trying to find a territory that would be safe for them, and they were replaced with federal commanders who in fact were Union soldiers, were also constituents of them, and they had these bills that were being passed. But at the same time, the Emancipation Proclamation did not really support the slaves right away, because the bill were being proposed but it had not passed yet. Now some freed the slaves, some of the federal commanders freed the slaves, others sent them back to their master for lack of means to care for them. So when they were sent back to their masters, it is when these slaves that were freed might go back to a master who were more empathetic to their needs and were fair, and as long as they did their jobs, they were treated with respect. But most masters did not really look at their slaves as being equally yoked to them, or as having any rights other than the rights that they had given these slaves, as being their masters, working as sharecroppers, or working in the house as maids, or whatever chores that they had given them, whatever agreements, because they had to sign agreements. And many of the federal commanders did sell slaves over to plantation owners. The Confiscation Act declared all slaves taking refuge behind Union lines captives of war who were to be set free. So if they were taking refuge behind the Union lines, and if they were captives of war, they were to be set free. Because once the federal government got involved, there were decisions made for the slaves, but they would need to become self-reliant, and I'll get to that here in a moment. The act essentially paved the way for the Emancipation Proclamation and solved the immediate dilemma facing the Army concerning the status of slaves within its jurisdiction. So the act essentially, it paved the way for the Emancipation Proclamation to become active, and it solved the problems of the Army concerning their obligations to these slaves while they were within the territory, the Southern territory of the Union soldiers. So within its jurisdiction, the armies felt as though they were obligated, and they had to go through some steps of finding ways to. It's called a Freedmen's Bureau. So there were coalitions had begun, and these bureaus were focused on particular dilemmas that was going on regarding the community, with the white women wanting to vote, and they weren't given the rights to vote equally as their middle class husbands. And so they had so many things that was going on at the same time when they declared that all the slaves that were taking refuge behind the Union lines, that they were to be set free as long as they were captives of war. After this act was passed, thousands of Southern slaves became freed men. And I'm sure they were given some voucher that they needed to carry, like an identification, just so that, if they ran into these checkpoints or they ran into someone that were very over women as far as the mobs and everything. Oftentimes the mobs would, though you have ID, they would take the vouchers and tear them up and take these slaves in and mistreat them or hang them. So there were so many things so many stories that are still left undocumented. But it was a terrible time for African Americans who were slaves here in the U.S. in 1862. After this act was passed, thousands of Southern slaves became freedmen. Though they had eagerly awaited their liberators, freedom was accompanied by frightening uncertainties. So that's what I had just mentioned, that they were waiting to be given their rights and to given their rights to America, to a plantation where they would be safe and they would be guided and given refuge while they're working in the fields or whatever jobs that they had in the households of the owners, of the masters. Homeless with few possessions, blacks fleeing to Union lines for protection found themselves as dependent on the federal government for their existence as they had been on their masters. So the slaves were homeless once they were freed men, because they didn't get, I don't know if they were paid any money. They probably were given something to get by with, but they were homeless and they didn't have very many possessions. They didn't have any valuables. They might have had a coat, some shoes, or carrying like a little sack on their back or something. But they were free, but they didn't have very many possessions. And so the blacks flee into Union lines. They had to reach Union lines for safety. They found themselves dependent on the federal government, and even still yet today, in 2014, we have blacks who are considered a minority working class who works minimum wage, and they're earning low income, and they're given housing, they're given stipends, but they're able to get jobs and get training in jobs like with the state or the government or the county or the city. And then once they're situated with these jobs, then they're given vouchers. They're given some type of WIC credit where they can go out and apply for housing. And there's many women that I'm fully aware of now that they purchase houses because they were single mothers and they were able to get refuge for their children. And that's in the contemporary. But back then, similar things that were taking place, and they didn't have any place to go. They didn't have work, they didn't have money, they didn't have skills, they didn't know where they were. They were in America and let loose. And it was nothing but brush and hills and mountains and gators and creeping things and beasts out there in these fields. And imagine, you're free, and then you have to watch out for these corrupt commanders or corrupt mob cults that were out there, what they call clans, that were out there like bounty hunters searching for freed slaves because they didn't believe that they had rights. And it's one of the reasons that now there are amendments passed to protect the African Americans. Now, when The slaves, once they reached the Union lines for protection, they ended up being dependent, solely dependent on the federal government for their existence, like just for being African American, brought over here in chains, and then we probably were on plantations for some years, maybe 30 to 40 years, and then now you're free, and where are you going to go? So that's something that is very difficult for someone now they're displaced. Um, where are you going to head? North, east, south, and west. And in order to go north, you needed to have education. But most of the freed slaves who were uneducated, they headed south to look for employment on the railroad or to do elevator jobs like bellboy or work in hotels, sweeping up and mopping and cleaning rooms, or working on the plantations. But they're, as society, as the industrial plants and machinery and everything, and machinery and equipment advanced in technology, it helped the slaves to be able to fit in into the working class and to be given jobs on the assembly line. But at this time, they were just displaced, and they were looking for freedoms, and they were very frightened, and they didn't know, they were losing hope, and they didn't know when they walked down the street if they were going to run into somebody that was going to kill them. So it was a terrible time for African Americans. But Washington issued no concrete policy. So though the slaves were solely dependent on the federal government for their existence, as they had been on their masters, like living with the masters, and they felt secure, Washington issued no concrete policy concerning their welfare. So they were just debating through with this Confiscation Act in 1862. And so the field commanders saddled with caring for they were saddled, meaning that they were overburdened with caring for the refugees. They resorted to various means of providing them with food, shelter, and clothing. So they went, I guess they received donations or whatever they did through the government. They were able to get food and clothing because our military always provide aid to the foreign countries now. So it was, at one time, the military had to provide aid to the freed slaves. And so now we have today is whenever a catastrophic storm or some type of problem happen, where someone is going through great losses due to a hurricane or a storm, then we have FEMA come out, or we have these Red Cross goes out there, and mission workers goes to these areas, locations where most of the time they're rural areas, and bring food and aid, and give them temporary assistance until they're able to get themselves a new place to live. Many freedmen herded into contraband camps were hired out to loyal unionist plantation owners for low wages, as I just spoke, and others in the Western Theater were assigned parcels of confiscated lands for subsistence farming. So what they were doing is they were building these compounds, these camps. And these camps, they even have these camps now in Iran. I mean, in the Iraqi camps are being built right now to assist the men over there. It's like they're doing institutionalized camping, whereby the military in Iraqi receive training for the U.S. government to be able to protect themselves and fight back their adversaries over in the Middle East, of which were the ISIL or the Levant. So that's in contemporary, but now at this time, the slaves were not given guns. They were only given food, clothing, and a place to live. And so some of them, I think during this time, they still were not allowed to read, to educate themselves until they weren't allowed to read and educate themselves until until this act was passed. Further on, the Federal Bureau got involved, And so the proclamation, emancipation, where it was just a way for the union plantation federal commanders to sort of like get these slaves um, to a particular concern in the status of them within a jurisdiction where they'll be safe. Unaccustomed to administering refugee relief, the Army generally managed to maintain freedmen at a subsistence level. So, um, the subsistence level is that they were on a budget, and so they needed to distribute whatever they had at that time to these people. And so when it's a subsistence level, sometime when more slaves come in, these slaves would have to move on to another camp because there's not enough aid and food and products and supplies to share with those who are coming in from the usage of supplying the needs of those slaves who are already there. So the unaccustomed to administering refugee relief, the Army generally managed to maintain freedmen at a subsistence level, but many died of disease in overcrowded stockades, and some voluntarily returned to their homes because of deplorable conditions. And at the time of when there were war, and there was typhoid fever, malaria, and there were some of these soldiers, in fact, they were sufferers of STDs, and because they're out there in the field for so long in occupation, by the time it did return, it had progressed to a stage of being incurable. But that's another story. But there were many diseases, and as well as the Africans, the Indians also, the Native Americans died from disease and overcrowded stockades, but the blacks died in overcrowded stockades. But the Native Americans were also being subjected under the Russians. So the Russians were trying to overbear these Native Americans and move them out, because before everyone was really stationed out, because many of the Indians moved out to the west, to California, the Midwest, Nevada, a place like that, and then some moved south, Georgia and Louisiana, and places like in the lower area of Texas and down to Florida. So as many died of overcrowded stockades, many of the slaves died. Some voluntarily returned to their homes because of deplorable conditions. Supplemental aid arrived from northern relief societies that collected food and clothing for the freed men, and by 1862 began sending teachers to educate them. So this is where is very interesting, because the slaves needed to become self-reliant. They needed to become able-bodied to be able to not depend anymore on federal government for their existence. And many were not educated. Many decided to work on the plantations or go right back to the same torture, whatever they experienced with the masters, because many of those masters was very mean to the slaves. No matter how well they worked, or how progressive or productive they were in the fields, whatever jobs they assigned, they were very mean to these slaves. But the Northern Relief Societies, it's like I had mentioned earlier, if any slave decided to migrate north, he or she needed to attend college. They needed to become educated, because there was a New England Freedmen's Aid Society, and that aid society operated schools in South Carolina. And before the war ended, blacks in Mississippi and Georgia, they founded schools for their own people. And many of the schools, even here in the South and Florida area, were predominantly black. But what took place is the funds were low, and many of the books and material were outdated. So blacks was really downsized. They were dumbed down, not purposely, but dumbed down because the books that they were supplying in the black-owned schools were really being donated to these schools by higher learning white predominant schools. And so, you know, the blacks did launch schools for their own people, but then in the end, before the assassination of Martin Luther King, there were a Brown versus Education lawsuit whereby this young girl, there were several girls, they weren't allowed to attend, they weren't allowed to educate themselves because of this Northern Relief Society. They had the New England Freedmen's Aid Society. There were many NAACP got involved and lawyers and things like that because there were laws to protect African Americans, and they were not allowed to stop these girls from attend. It was one particular girl from attending school, and it was really crazy what they were doing to her, and she had to be escorted on campus or escorted in the school grounds in order to get educated, and everyone stared her down. So it was very miserable, I'm sure. Not all freedmen dared trust whites professing friendship, so they weren't allowed to just trust anyone. But if they did find a master, they didn't really trust their masters at all. They weren't too friendly with them. Abuses of slavery were fresh in their minds, and that's the reason why. And many suffered injustices at the hands of invading white soldiers. Now they're saying these are invaded white soldiers. Some of these, I think that they're trying to sweeten this sentence up here, trying to be conventional about it. They were not invading white soldiers. These men were local townsmen, middle class mobs, local townsmen, businessmen that owned their businesses, like their own little shops and stores, and they got together and they heard the slaves were freed, and they decided to group up and come up with a plan to go out and hunt, like a witch hunt, and find slaves in predicaments where they weren't able to run or get away from them. So I don't think it was white soldiers, but right here it does say that they were white soldiers that had invaded these slaves, had suffered many injustices at the hands of them. Knowing the war was not over, unsure of what or whom to believe, many of the slaves preferred to stay with their masters, and whose power over them would remain after Union forces moved on. So if you decided to go back to a plantation owner, master, then once you go back, the Union soldiers were no longer, because they brought you back, were no longer allowed to go on private property and to go and try to take a slave from there because of an abuse that they were suffering there. Now others joined the Federal Army after 1863. So there were some black slaves joined the Federal Army after 1863, and or they followed it aimlessly, not knowing what else to do. So they just wanted to serve their country. They wanted a peace of mind. They wanted to build up the skills and to develop and to improve in their lives, to become responsible citizens of America. And so there were several decisions that blacks were given. As you can move north and attend school, become educated, become a lawyer, doctor, teacher, or a pastor, or you could join the military. So this is something that decisions that they were given alternative options. Not all freedmen dared trust whites professing friendship. Okay, knowing the war was not over, unsure of what or whom to believe, many preferred to stay with their masters, and again that they had joined the forces just because they didn't have anything to do. In 1863, the War Department created the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, and this is something that I was looking for, the AFIC, the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission to suggest methods for dealing with emancipated slaves. So the commission's key conclusion was that no bureau or agency set up to help the ex-slaves should become a permanent institution, but should instead encourage the Negroes to become self-reliant as quickly as possible. So the commission's key bureau was the Freedmen's Bureau, and this agency was set up and designed to help ex-slaves become skilled in trade, to learn trades, like blacksmith, or they learn how to, they just learn skills working on a railroad. They're given independence to learn skills to become independent contractors, so that they would be able to open up their own businesses. And so out of the commission's report was born on March 4, 1865, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And despite its official title, its main purpose was to help the more than 4 million former slaves, most with any resources or education, populating the South after the war. So they were populating the South after the war, and they needed to get themselves into action. They couldn't lazy around, and so that they would not go back to the same old lifestyle of being mistreated in suffrage as a slave on plantations. They were given an opportunity to become independent and to learn trades, and to, as well as to develop in the community that they were in, to get involved with as becoming small business owners. Despite its official title, its main purpose was to help the more than 4 million former slaves, most with any resources or education, populating the South after the war. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau with a lifespan of just 1 year to distribute clothing, food, and fuel to destitute freedmen, and to oversee all subjects relating to their condition in the South. So they also had some health issues. The Bureau was not granted a separate budget for its work, but instead drew funds from the Department of War. So they could receive funds from the Department of War, and these funds usually are from the Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration Charter Agreement is for foreigners, but it's similar to that, as they were given funds so that they would be able to help these people relating to their conditions, and also to assist them so that they would not be destitute freedmen, but they would be independent freedmen. The Bureau was not granted a separate budget for its work, but instead drew funds from the Department of War. Heading the Bureau was none other than General Oliver O. Howard, a graduate of Bowdoin and West Point, and a very distinguished Civil War veteran. A devout churchgoer and fervent civil rights advocate, Howard helped manage the Bureau's approximately 900 agents. So there were 900 agents in the Bureau, and these were like social workers that were out there, and they were helping these slaves who were in these camps, these contraband camps, to make sure that they are not going to be released until they're able to find a place to live, and they're able to find somewhere where they're not going to be in any great harm. One of the most difficult challenges of the Bureau was instituting a judicial system that would be fair to both blacks and whites. At first, the Bureau established its own judicial authority, with local agents setting up temporary three-man courts to hear individual disputes between white employees who were dealing for the first time with black employees demanding fair wages. So when you have white employees dealing with black employees demanding fair wages, they would have to make sure the union was involved. But that's the union serve to make sure that someone's rights are being exercised, and that they're not being underprivileged, these rights, as equal as any other citizen in the U.S. Without adequate manpower or financial resources for such an enormous undertaking, however, the Bureau instead worked to persuade the Southern states to recognize racial equality in their own judicial proceedings. Bureau agents monitored state and local legal affairs and often intervened on behalf of blacks. So they often intervened on behalf of blacks because they still, thus freedmen, they still were experiencing denialism from those commanders and white soldiers, as they mentioned, that were subjected to abuse them. And their only objectives was to get them back on the plantation and be very controlling and to make these blacks' lives a miserable hell. Now, another challenge in facing the Negro in the South was the abysmal lack of healthcare services. And as I mentioned, they were sufferers of diseases. The Bureau attempted to strengthen existing medical care facilities as well as expand services into rural areas through new established clinics. So they were getting to work. I mean, these slaves they were not abandoned. They were receiving assistance. And the agents were getting to work, and they were recognizing when there were problems and there were dilemmas, and whenever these slaves was facing individual needs to receive whatever they needed, and they were able to help them receive land. They had been promised less than 1% of the 4 million ex-slaves populating the South. So the system of free labor economy was introduced, and that was another of the Bureau's responsibilities, and was to sort land in low compound areas, that they would sort land for these slaves so they can have their own land, and it's a nice small family bunk. Now, the Bureau's goal in this respect was to return the ex-slaves to plantation labor, which is still essential to the Southern economy, but to do so under conditions that would allow blacks to work their way up and out of the labor class. Now, one way to accomplish this was to distribute lands confiscated or abandoned during the war, some 850,000 acres in 1865, to newly freed slaves. And so that's when the 40 acres and a mule slogan for the reconstruction of the land grant plan had taken effect. But in the end, only about 2,000 South Carolina and 1,500 Georgia freedmen actually received the land they had been promised. Another challenge facing the Negro in the South was the abysmal lack of health care services. The Bureau attempted to strengthen existing medical care facilities as well as expand services in rural areas through newly established clinics. And perhaps the most important contribution the Bureau made to Reconstruction efforts involved expanding educational opportunities to emancipated African Americans. And that is when the Reconstruction became a law for African Americans. It was very important for them to contribute to that Federal Bureau of Freedmen to help Reconstruction efforts in educating African Americans who were emancipated. And so they were still yet, when they came up with this new opportunity for them, they were still yet lacking adequate resources. The Bureau did not establish new schools itself for blacks, but instead the Bureau acted as a catalyst between the Northern Relief Societies, who in fact were training blacks to become teachers, and local governments and individuals. Then by 1869, about 3,000 new schools serving more than 150,000 pupils, as well as dozens of evening and private schools, had been established. And the American Missionary Association and the American Freedmen's Union Commission, the Bureau was working on a way and finding staff, the first black colleges in the South, that would work in the first black colleges in the South, all of which were initially designed to train black teachers who would teach black students. So what they were trying to do is to make sure that the culture, that a multicultural of people of color who were black and browns and yellow skins, that they were able to receive education from teachers who could attest to the condition they were living, who in fact may have come from that background and developed themselves and became professional teachers. And so these blacks were seated in classes in black colleges in the South with teachers who were also black teachers as they were black students. Also, despite inadequate funding and a shortage of facilities, the Bureau enabled an estimated 500,000 freedmen to receive medical attention in more than 100 hospitals. Okay, so now they were expanding these facilities and expanding the grant funds to, though if the grant funding were inadequate, to assist these African Americans in more than 100 hospitals who were ill. Despite its accomplishments, the Freedmen's Bureau was also known to be a corrupt and often inefficient organization. Although Howard himself was above reproach, the agents in the field, usually left completely to their own devices, used their positions to exact money and power from the very people they were meant to serve. So what they did is Howard, he was not a reproachment of men, but in fact, he was above that. So when someone is a reproachment of men, their demeaning nature and their condescending behavior demotivates a person who needs to be encouraged to become self-reliant. And so that's what they mean with this paragraph. Now in December 18, let me see if I missed anything. Okay, in December 1865, the radical Republicans in Congress managed to pass a strengthened Freedmen's Bureau Act, but were disappointed when President Andrew Johnson vetoed it. Okay, so President Andrew Johnson vetoed it, because they were radical Republicans in Congress, as it stated. And they passed the Freedmen's Bureau Act, but the president vetoed it for some reason. So maybe the president didn't find that that any more additional funds would change the fact that these African Americans were not going to be accepted anyways, though they were free. So he vetoed that bill, and it was to strengthen the Freedmen's Bureau Act or to protect it with addendums. These addendums were through jurisdiction or through court districts, protected this law so that it would not have clauses in it, and that they these politicians or these lawyers or whoever they were corrupt would not try to change laws that were already passed once these slaves were out of the protection camps of the unionists, and these unionists were federal commanders. Officially existing for just 1 year, plagued by corruption and lacking enough funding and manpower to complete what was indeed a Herculean task. So there you go. It was a multiplex of tasks that they were designing to help strengthen the Freedmen's Bureau Act. And the Bureau nonetheless made great strides in providing newly emancipated Negroes with access to equal justice, fair labor practices, land, and education. So the Bureau, they were working very hard in providing emancipated Negroes with access to equal justice. They were doing all that they could in their powers to assist them so that they can be able to become small businessmen or to become professionals. In order to fully understand the plight of the freed slaves and what brought about the Freedmen's Bureau, one must fully examine the slavery issue as it existed in the country at the time. To do that, both the preliminary and the final reports of the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission are provided. And these are commissions or chambers. They are chambers of commerce, and they are located in in the county area of 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 that particular state or city or that town. And so these um, commissions they're extracted in their entirety from the official records of the War of Rebellion, because the Federal Freedmen's Inquiry Commission um, were were being attacked, and it was also um, a probability that the official records of the War of the Rebellion would be extracted from the constitutional from the bills from the constitutional bills, and once a bill is passed, it goes into the U.S. Constitution. So that is the information that I want to share with those of you who are viewing. Um, it does mention here that this commission had decided to all emancipated African Americans were to become self-reliant. Were told to go to school and to educate themselves and to become pastors and lawyers or whatever that their souls desired, to better themselves and to feel better about themselves. And that is the conclusion of the the freed slaves of the Civil War. And the article was found at civilwarhome.com, copyright 1997 through 2014. I'm looking for an author name, but I do not find an author name. Okay, but that concludes the copyright 1997 through 2014, civilwarhome.com. Wrote an article on freedmen, the freed slaves of the Civil War in 1997. Thank you and have a good night.